Aloha and welcome back to the Outrigger Waikiki, where we're back with another Surfers in Residence. My name is Marco. I'll be hosting today in for Tammy Moniz. And big mahalo to everyone for this opportunity to sit down with legendary surfer, shaper, and organizer, Mr. Randy Rarick. Welcome.
Marco, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And if I'm not mistaken, this is where it all started. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's kind of neat that we're sitting here at Waikiki, and I was 10 years old, and literally 50 feet away from where we're sitting, Rabbit Kekai, the famous beach boy, took me out in the water on a little 1-2 foot day and pushed me into my first wave. And I'll never forget that because he shoved me into the wave, and I was riding along, standing up, and I was 10 years old at that time. And I remember I rode about probably 30, 40 yards, and then the wave faded out. And I looked back and I said, oh my gosh, I was propelled through the water with no propeller, no motor, no anything. It was just the energy of the wave. And I said, I really want to be a surfer now. And that was probably 60 plus years ago now.
And it's amazing right here. It probably changed a little bit over that time.
You know, yes and no. I mean, it's a lot more people, obviously, but basically the surf is the same. And Waikiki's always been a magical place. And, you know, people come here and they just are enthralled. And even with thousands of tourists here, it's still a fascinating and really wonderful place.
Jerry Lopez said that you started shaping boards when you were only 12 or 13 years old. Now, how did you get into production at such an early age? What drew you to that?
Well, I lived on the southeast shore over around the other side of Diamond Head. And when I was 11 years old, I went into a surf shop in Kakarako, and it was a Velzy franchise. And I remember walking in, and the smell of the resin was intoxicating. And I was 11 years old, and I looked around and I went, wow, this place is amazing. And I went, I'm going to become a surfboard builder. At 11 years old, I made that decision. And so back then we had no YouTube or Facebook or anything like that. So it was through books or surf magazines that were around at the time that I studied them, and I began to fix dings. And in the neighborhood I lived in was Jerry Lopez, and it was a real surf neighborhood. We had Mark Cunningham, the famous body surfer. We had Mark Fu, the big wave rider. We had Dennis Pang, another shaper. And I said, look, you guys, I'll fix your boards for free just so I could learn how to fix them better. So at 11, 12 years old, I started fixing the dings in the local neighborhood kids, and then gradually learned a little bit. And then I went to the local surf shops. There was Inter Island Surf Shop and Surfboards Hawaii here in Hawaii, and looked through the back door or the back window and watched the guys and picked up little tricks. And then I decided, well, I'm going to make my first board. And at 12 years old, that's what I did.
Pretty early on, you started globetrotting, traveling the world, looking for exotic surf spots before other people were doing that. Was that sort of chasing legends of the past, or did you already have some vision of a future network?
Well, it's interesting because I grew up here in Hawaii, and everybody wants to come to Hawaii. But my early exposure to surfing was, as I said, through surf magazines or surf movies, and we'd see pictures of, like, California. It would be glassy and sandy beaches, and they'd just walk out to the shore and be surfing these beach breaks. And I said, God, I really want to see what the rest of the world looks like. And so my first trip off the island, I think I was 15 years old. I went and stayed with some friends and my parents in California, and what a cultural shock to come from, local Haole, Hawaii boy and going to the mainland and then seeing the surf culture as it really began to boom in the early 60s. And so that really prompted me to want to see what the rest of the world was like. And so I kind of made it a point of saying, well, I'm from Hawaii, but I'm going to leave Hawaii to go see what the rest of the world is, and use surfing as my excuse to do so. And I set off on 16. I went traveling again. And when I turned 18, graduated from high school, I went and lived in Australia for a year. And it just started a pattern which over the last 50 years, I've traveled through 170 different countries, and I've surfed in about 70 of them.
Wow. And what was the general reception when this Haole would show up with a surfboard in some place? Did most of these exotic destinations already have their own surf cultures?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of places that, like, say, Australia, coming from Hawaii, everybody go, oh, wow, you're from Hawaii, what's Hawaii like? And they usually were really friendly. I never ran into any problems anywhere. And probably the worst place I had any hassles with surfers and localisms when I went to San Francisco, of all places, and I had to do a localism south of the bay there. But anyway, it was a really great way to see different cultures, appreciate different lifestyles of other people, and use surfing as your entree into those places. And really, I've I've been to South Africa 26 times. I've been to Europe about 30 times. I've been to Asia and Japan 50 times. And all those places, if you're a surfer, people are fascinated by you. And nowadays, surfing is worldwide. I mean, they're surfing everywhere there's an ocean. But back then in the 60s and 70s, it was still kind of unique. So being from Hawaii, it was really special to be traveling someplace else in the world.
Well, and I noticed you had mentioned that you were thankful that you got to Hawaii early enough that you were raised with local values.
Well, what you got to do is to get respect, you got to show respect. So a lot of times people from the mainland will come over here, they'll be bossy, they'll be pushy, and they'll try to get their way. You got to do the Hawaiian style where you listen to people first, see what they do, respect what they do, and then let them lead you. And if you can do that, and people that come to Hawaii that adopt that, that's why they love coming back to Hawaii, because they respect the people, they respect the culture. And that's what's really important here in Hawaii, because, we have such an influx of different cultures. There's 7 major, the Asians, the Polynesians, the Haoles, and so they all kind of blend together. And that's what makes Hawaii such a special place, because there's no one dominant group that, overshadows the other ones. You have to learn to mix with the other if you want to be and stay here.
Those are wise words, and I hope everybody heeds them. While you were on the Pro Tour competing in '76, you started working in the office and picking up some admin duties as well. What was drawing you to an office job when you're a surf pro?
Well, there was no such thing as professional surfing, pre to the mid '70s. And so I kind of was at the very tail end of my career as a competitive surfer. I won the Hawaii State Surfing Championships when I was 17. I surfed in the old Duke Kahanamoku Invitational. I surfed in the Smirnoff Pro, the major pro events in the late 60s, early 70s. And I was a decent surfer. I mean, I won a few here and there, but I realized I wasn't going to be the top of the heap. I was, basically a journeyman surfer is what I consider myself. And so I thought, well, if I can't do it, can I help other guys do it? Because we had this dream in the early 70s that you could become what was known as a pro surfer, because at that stage there was no such thing. And so I teamed up with Fred Hemmings, who was the local promoter at the time, and he was producing some of the events. And I said, Fred, let's develop this professional thing, because it's coming. It wasn't there yet. We were at that stage. It was still amateur events with you got a tin trophy and a bar of wax, and they just started bringing money in the very late '60s, early '70s. And I said, this is coming. Pro surfing is going to be a deal, and we should be on the forefront of it. So Fred and I formed an organization called International Professional Surfing, IPS for short, which is basically the forerunner of what is today's now called the World Surf League. And we started putting events on. And the first year, I was still trying to compete and still trying to be an administrator. So I'd go out, surf in my heat, come back in, take off that, and then I'd be handing the jerseys out to the next guy. And I realized after a year of that, I had to make a decision.
Make some calls.
Yeah. Am I going to be try to be a budding pro surfer, or am I going to try to help make pro surfing happen? And that's what I switched over to administration and decided, okay, we're gonna run with this and make pro surfing a legitimate profession.
Well, and speaking of which, one of the things that I thought was interesting is that there was some pushback that some people said, well, surfing is an art form and it can't be judged competitively. And then you guys wrote the book on how to qualify and how to judge. How ready was the rest of the world to get on board and share your vision?
At that stage, not at all. I mean, we had a lot of pushback where people are saying surfing's a soulful deal. You're fornicating with Mother Nature if you want to be a professional surfer.
Wow.
And we were going, no. I said you can be both. You can go out and have a good time and be a recreational surfer and enjoy your time in the water. And if you're good enough at it, you could go out and try to best yourself over the other competitors and consider yourself a professional surfer. And there was enough sponsors in the early days to begin to say, yeah, we'll put money behind that. And I remember in the early mid '70s going, one day, we'll be professional surfers. And I remember going to, I think it was Brazil or somewhere in probably the late '70s, early '80s, and it said occupation. And I wrote professional surfer.
Nice.
On my visa application. I went, you know what? That's what we are. And so I was in the first wave of the pro surfers, and then I was helping to organize and construct the whole tour. And then we started off, I think we had $100,000 worldwide. And now they're giving away like $400,000 at each event. So it came a long way. And I saw that I could see the future of the professional surfing would take off. And so really, there was no such thing as a sport of surfing up to that point. In mid-'70s, when we started the tour, then surfing became a sport. And of course, professional surfing grew and grew and grew. And, 2 years ago, it became an Olympic sport. So it is a sport, but it is also actually more so a lifestyle. And if you look at all the people that surf, just the very top of the pyramid, the very best of the best are the pro surfers, and everybody else is a recreational surfer. Mm-hmm. And so really surfing is a lifestyle sport and not so much a competitive sport, even though there is competition.
Let's talk about the responsibility of, quote, calling the day, where you've got to balance safety, competition, and let's face it, commerce.
Exactly. Well, you got to try to make everybody happy. You got the surfers, they want to have perfect surf. You got the sponsors, they want the sun to be out and to be a good show. And then you have the residents that live in the area, and they're willing to, share the beaches, and they want to give up just so much. And then they realize, hey, there's a limit to that. So it's a really balancing deal. And as a director, especially on the North Shore, luckily I live out at Sunset Beach, and I know the waves really well, and I've grew up there. And so we have what we call usually a holding period of maybe a 2-week window. And you have maybe 3 or 4 days of competition. So you try to pick the very best days that are, as you said, for safety purposes. You don't want to send the guys out to get killed.
Right.
At the same time, you want to try to get the best surf possible. And if you can balance all those needs and it all comes together and you have good surf makes for a good surf contest. And it's as simple as that. And when the waves are good, it made my job as a director deciding when to send the guys out or not. And there are times when you just had to do it in sometimes mediocre surf. But in the end, the guys look at the leaderboard and then the results at the end, and they only remember the winner. So the rest gets left behind.
What's a day like in an organizer before credit cards, cell phones, and the internet?
Well, I'll tell you, it was the early days. Like Fred Hemmings, for instance, the Pipeline Masters, which is probably the most famous surf contest in the world. He went down there with a card table, 6 chairs, and a bullhorn, and was able to pull an event off with maybe 50 people on the beach. That same event, last year had 10,000 people watching it and millions watching it online. And of course, we didn't have internet back in the old days. It was about what was happening just amongst the surfers themselves and trying to keep a few sponsors happy. You got some coverage in a surf magazine, maybe a surf movie, and that was good enough. But now it's worldwide and it's instantaneous.
And so, and that being the case, the boom of social media extends the reach of the organizer, but it also gives some surfers interesting avenues to go it alone and create their own content. Are these 2 avenues at odds, or do they ultimately fuel each other?
No, I think they complement each other because, a sponsor who puts up money is looking for promotional value of whatever product it is or whatever service it is that they're promoting. They're trying to get exposure so people become aware of it and buy the product or go whatever their place that they're trying to promote or whatever it may be. On the other hand, the surfers try to do the best they can to get some prize money, obviously. Mm-hmm. And they're sponsored by different sponsors who the better they do, the better the sponsorship they get. And what's interesting, a lot of surfers that were pro surfers then take that knowledge and move into another category as they get older. A good example here at the Outrigger is Tony Moniz. Well, Tony Moniz runs the surf school, and his family. And
Tammy hosts the show.
Exactly. Well, but when I was running the events on the North Shore, and he was one of the top 10 competitors in Hawaii at the time. And, I'd be handing Tony a jersey and he'd go out and hopefully do good and won his fair share of events. And now his kids are on the world tour. So what's really neat is his love of surfing translated into a business with his family as becoming a beach boy, basically, giving surf lessons and surf schools here. And now his kids have gone on to become professional surfers, and a lot of them, like, they'll start a clothing line, for instance, and or some kind of service in surfing. So it really is good that professional surfing has led those guys to a profession that continues on after their competitive career is over.
That's awesome. And I want to talk about the Hawaiian Vintage Surf Auction. We talked just a little bit before because they're replaying them. They are so much fun to watch for any of you who haven't seen one yet. One thing that struck me as interesting was that there was a Greg Knoll board that had never been ridden. So that tells me somebody was already anticipating the value, the future of surfing. Was there much collecting going on that early on, or was that sort of a one-off?
Surf collectibles really have just come into their own in the last 30 years. Up through probably the 70s, there wasn't much interest. But then you had the early wood boards from the turn of the century up through the 30s and 40s. And then you had the balsa boards of the 50s. And then foam was introduced in the 60s with longboards. And then shortboards came along in the 70s up through till today. So really, it was only in the last 30 years that interest in some of that older equipment and older paraphernalia and surf memorabilia came into vogue. So about 20, maybe 25, 30 years ago, the first auction was held. They had a couple in California and a lot of California stuff. And then we started running them here in Hawaii in the early 2000s. And Hawaiian stuff in particular, people really like because it was made in limited quantity. So like a Greg Knoll big wave board, say. Greg was from California, had a manufacturing operation, but he also had a dealership here in Hawaii. And so the boards that were made to be ridden in the Hawaiian waves were limited, and so therefore people are looking for stuff like that. So there's surfboards, there's attire like a T-shirt or shorts or something like that, water slide decals with the names of the different manufacturers, price lists from those guys. So there's a lot of surf memorabilia that people when they're kids remember that. And as they get older and affluent and they can afford to buy stuff, you get into your 40s, 50s, and you go, I remember when I was, 15, 18 years old, that board was, the board I always coveted, but I never could afford to buy it. Well, now I can buy one and I can put it on the wall and get some things. So the auctions are a great way to bring our history of our sport via the equipment of our sport together and for people to share it, love it, and appreciate it.
So it's 100 years of surfboard history in 5 minutes with Randy Rarick, okay?
Right.
So we're going to start with the 1920 wave slider that I saw you auction, because that's sort of a base model. There's no fins or there's nothing. So just a couple years, like balsa. When did balsa come in?
That came in the 50s. It was
50s.
During the World War II, they used it for airplane wings and what have you, and life rafts, and they turned those life rafts into surfboards after World War II was finished.
Right on. Single fin. When did that slide get a fin?
Well, fins came in 1938 is they're credited with the first fin put on a surfboard.
38. Okay. Wax, because I saw some of the boards were cross-hatched.
They were cross-hatched, and that was a way to have some traction to stay on the board. And a guy from California took some wax from his mother's kitchen, it was floor wax, and he put it on his board and didn't polish it out, and he found he was able to stick on that, and that's how wax developed.
What year was that around?
That was in the early 50s.
50s also, okay. And let's see here. I've got the leash.
The leash, it's interesting because the first leashes were put on the nose of the boards, actually.
Wow.
And Jack O'Neill, who made O'Neill wetsuits, had one on with a suction cup, and the suction cup popped off, hit him in the eye, and he lost his eye, and that's why he had a patch.
No.
So that you see pictures of Jack O'Neill developed the O'Neill wetsuit. Got that from the early surf leash. So the early leashes came out in the early 70s.
70s,
Yeah.
all right. And then I've got, when we switch to foam.
Right. Well, foam was developed in late 50s, and once again, as a product coming out of World War II, they were trying to figure out a way to make lightweight stuff. And instead of a balsa board, which was lighter than a redwood board, well, foam was lighter than that. So foam became the early ones were called flexi flyers because they flexed a lot. And that's why they put a wood stringer down the middle of the blanks, they call them.
So support, okay. And when did they start working on rails?
Well, rails, first the square railed, which were the paddle boards and the plank boards of the 30s and 40s, evolved into, they figured out you could design like an airplane wing we got foil. And so the better the foil, the better, the faster the board went. And really, it wasn't until the 40s that foils and wings and rails all came into play.
And when did they start focusing on tails? Because there's a lot about that.
Well, there's, that goes all the way back.
All the way.
Because back in the old day, they had just old planks, and so whatever the shape of the plank was the tail of the board.
Gotcha.
And then as they figured out, cut away the tail, make it narrow. They had the wide tail boards here in Waikiki during the 30s and into the early 40s, and they were called slide ass because they were so wide, and they pulled them in. They started cutting them in and made what they called a hot curl, and that would hold in a hollow wave. So tails began to change probably the same time as rails.
And then let's see here, and noses.
Well, once again, at first, all the boards here in Waikiki had a big round bloopy nose, but as they got into bigger waves, they realized you didn't need all that area, and they started making more and more pointed. So I think noses got pointed probably in the late 40s into the 50s, right around there is when really designs for that came into play.
All right. And shortboard revolution?
Well, that started, it was over about a 2-year period from 67 to 69. What happened was Bob McTavish came over from Australia with what was considered a shortboard at 9.2, and kind of a shot across the bow to all the Americans. And then they realized instead of trying to style it on a big board, it was a lot quicker and easier to maneuver a shorter board. And so it took about 2 years, and they went from 10-foot boards to 7-foot boards.
Mm-hmm. And multi-fins.
Well, there's
Twin
been
fin.
there's been variety of fins made even back in the 20s and 30s. They were trying multiple fins back in those
Really?
days. But single fins became pretty much the de rigueur choice all through the 60s and into the early 70s. Came along with twin fins in the early 70s, and then a resurgence again in the early 80s. And then the 3-fin came along in 1981, and it's pretty much stayed with us since then. So the 3-fin, but there's 4 fins, single fins, 2+1. There's combinations of different fins.
There you have it, folks. That's 100 years of surfboard history in 5 minutes with Randy Rarick.
My pleasure.
And you want to talk about your fin?
Well, I've got a design that I use now that's a kind of a combination. I'm sort of old school, so single fins suit me, and I still ride a lot of longboards. And I've got a fin that has what's called Power Flex Tip Flex, which is it's carbon fiber and it's high technology, but the tip of the fin flexes, so it's kind of like as you go down into a turn, it flexes, loads up, and then as you come out of the turn, it releases and gives you a little twang, a spring of. And so I've got a design that comes in 7.5, 8.5, 9, and 10-inch length for different boards, and available at local surf shops, and everybody loves them.
And now the image of the surfer has gone through a bunch of evolutions as well, starting off with like counterculture, beach bum, then you've got like beach blanket bingo, and then now, thanks to you, pro surfer. So what about surfing allowed it to survive so many redefined definitions?
Well, it's interesting you said that, because when I was younger, the word surf bum came from the ski bums. Those are the guys that went skiing, and they devote their whole time to being up in the mountains, and so there's an offshoot of that word from the skiers. But I always thought it was such an insult that they called us bums, the idea of being a surf bum. And I said, when we started pro surfing, I wanted pro surfing to legitimize a surfer. So instead of being considered a bum, you were considered something special. And pro surfing did just that. So all our efforts of developing professional surfing to give it credibility, to this day, now you've got lawyers, doctors that surf, and guys that are making hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars in endorsements. So it went from being, a counterculture kind of negative to now everybody wants to be a surfer.
Okay, talking about good advice. So Duke himself told you that whatever you put into surfing, you'll get back 10 times.
Exactly.
Accurate assessment?
Well, I think I've given I've given probably more than 10 times worth for sure. No, it's interesting because at the opening ceremony for the Duke Hanamoku Invitational, which was the most prestigious event back in the late 60s and early 70s. It was here in Waikiki, right at the Royal Hawaiian, or actually in front of the Surf Rider. And Duke sat down with me for like 15, 20 minutes. There's all these people walking around, and he says, "Hey, boy, come here, sit down next to me." And he says, "What do you do?" And I, said, "Well, I'm trying to learn to be a surfer," and, blah, blah, blah. And he goes, he basically said that if you give back to what you get out of surfing, you'll get enjoyment, 10 times over. And so I took that to heart, and I said, you know what? I'm going to try my hardest to do anything and everything I can in the world of surfing to make other people enjoy it and feel good about it. And it's, I've literally done everything you can in surfing. I've, run surf movies. I run surf contests. I build surfboards. I've traveled the world of surfing, and everywhere I've gone, I've tried to help people out. And even to this day, people come out at Sunset Beach where I surf on a little 2-3 foot day, and I'll help position them and get them in place to get a wave. And when they're done, they just go, "Oh, that made my day." And that's it. So if you give back what you've gotten out of surfing, it'll be something that you'll take with you the rest of your life. And I've been doing it, I'm pushing mid-70s now, and I've been doing it for 65 years and still going strong.
And when you were taking tickets and running the projector for surf movies as a teenager, did you already have a sense that this was going to be a lifelong love affair with surfing?
I really, like I said earlier, making surfboards is something I wanted to do. And I wanted to just keep surfing and ride as many different kinds of waves and places I could. And it was, you're talking about surf movies. Because of what I've done, Bruce Brown, who developed the Endless Summer, picked me to be what they call a location manager for the Endless Summer 2, which was the sequel that he did to it. So I got to go around the world looking for surf. I got paid to go look for surf, and it was like one of the best jobs I ever had. And Bruce said to me, he said, Randy, he says, I couldn't have picked anybody better. And so, it gave me a chance to further the stoke that I've had about surfing.
One of my favorite quotes was from Ben Ipa, where he said that surfing will create images in your mind, snapshots in your mind that you will never be removed. What's some visions in the water that are burned into your brain?
I think for me, having traveled so young and so early, was seeing people who hadn't seen surfing just blow their mind when we paddled out. I was in West Africa, and we went to this point, and there's perfect little waves, and the kids would come out. Usually it was always the kids, and they would come down, and they would go, and then they were saying, bravo, hola, they're just loving the fact. And one of the fun things was when you fall off on a wave and you wipe out, they would all laugh. So we started falling off purposely and wiping out to get these kids having a good time. So it's just amazing how surfing, as you introduce it to different people, their perception of it and what they how they take it out of it. And as Ben said, everything's a snapshot along the way. And I can talk about surfboard designs. That's one of my favorites. I consider myself a surf historian, and I've repaired probably 10,000 surfboards and shaped about 15,000. So every time I see a different board in a different country or somebody creates, I find it fascinating that that's the continued perpetuation of our sport by creating the equipment that we ride. And that's the history of it. And that's one of the reasons why I love the idea of the vintage side of things.
Mm-hmm. And, talking about this inclusiveness and this kind of almost universal attraction to it, I don't want to dwell too deeply on it, but just as far as gender equality in sports, that's something that is a worthy topic. And of course, with prize money has been an issue. But there's no small achievement that happened this year where for the first time, men and women competed together in the eddy.
Well, it's interesting you brought that up because the women always had a hard time, didn't have enough prize money, didn't have enough sponsorship. Back in the 70s when Fred Hemmings and myself ran the Triple Crown events, we always had a women's Triple Crown. And we were always trying to get more and more sponsors, but it just was hard to do because there's a lot more male surfers than there were women at the time. Well, now the equality is caught back up, and the WSL has got equal pay for both men and women. But to be honest with you, and this is kind of controversial, I think the women should surf with the men. I really think they should. And the eddy was a good example. A couple of the ladies that surfed in the eddy beat some of the guys.
Sure.
And so if you put Carissa Moore, for instance, out in a pro event with a lot of the guys, she'll smoke them. I mean, she'll knock those guys. And the same thing, the top women surfers are a lot better than a lot of men. So I think for equality purposes, just let them all surf together. And, if a woman's going to be that good, she's going to rise to the top and she'll get the prize money. And, then those male chauvinists that, try to put the women down, what are they going to say?
Nothing.
Exactly. So that's my feeling, that you want equal prize money, equal representation, let them all surf together. Because out in the ocean, it's really the wave you're conquering, and you're not conquering the other competitors.
Sure.
It's not like a race where somebody gets across the line faster than the other person. In that case, obviously,
who's got the bigger quad?
Right, exactly. and in surfing, a lot of times the women surfers are much more elegant. They're much more beautiful to watch. And in certain conditions, they surf much better than the men. So competitive-wise, I think it'd be fun to put them all out there and see what happens.
That's an awesome note. As we wrap up, two things that I always love asking people, and especially someone who's done so many different things within, what's something that you never thought you would have done that you did?
Oh, my gosh. Well, when I went to Australia when I was 18, I went down there to go to college. I took commercial law and accounting, which was the most boring classes, but I had to take something, and it was my first year of university, and I went to Australia, and I thought I would go on to finish college and get, quote, a real job. Well, I spent a year in Australia, came back, opened up a surf shop. That surf shop led to me getting into the competitions. The competitions led me getting into helping professional surfing. I never thought I would see myself making a living out of surfing. I thought surfing was just going to be a pastime when I was young. And here it is 50, 60 years later, and I've led the most incredible life, and I wouldn't change a single thing.
Wow. And what's one thing that you underestimated that you thought was going to be a piece of cake that bit you on the butt?
That one's a tough one. I remember when I wanted to go out and surf big waves at Waimea Bay, and I thought, well, I was cocky enough and I was good enough, and Mother Nature swatted me down and held me under. I actually took off on a wave at Waimea, and the wave broke on top of me and broke my board in half. as I was standing on it. And so I thought something would be easier than it was, and it takes a lot of guts, it takes a lot of glory, and it takes a lot of ability to be able to ride big waves. So my hat's off to all those guys that ride Jaws and Wyman, all the big waves.
Wow. Well, that's awesome. I want to thank you for coming down today and spending this time with us. Big thank you to Randy Rarick. Check out his black tip fins. And as always, if you like this episode and enjoy what you saw today and want to see more, make sure you hit subscribe on the bottom of your screen and like it, and you can get more episodes. And in the meantime, mahalo for watching and aloha.